A massive blast in Ningo-Zhoushan port brings container ship fires back into focus, building a new regional carrier in the Middle East, and the Express Pearl Master held in Sri Lanka for over 3 years. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here with our August news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined by our correspondent, Gary Howard. August is often referred to as the silly season when it comes to news, but for things maritime, they have continued pretty much full steam ahead. We've had billion-dollar deals, major casualties, and record-high new building order books. So let's get right into it with Gary's first pick of the month.
Hi, Marcus. Yep, I had an interesting chat with Ben Palmer, president over at Inmarsat Maritime, about how things have gone at the satellite provider over the past couple of years. Inmarsat has seemed pretty slow to react to the spread of Starlink across shipping, a service which has proved very popular, especially among seafarers. We've written quite a few stories about various shipping giants adopting this across their entire fleets. Palmer got straight to the point, really, and he said, quote, "We've been through a transaction, and inevitably we've not been able to move at the pace that we want." Inmarsat was acquired by Viasat, a process which was announced in 2021, completed in May 2023, and that still really left any of the internal changes that you do once a merger of acquisition has been completed. The next task for Inmarsat is to get its message out to the market about its new product Nexus Wave, which includes the integration of LEO satellites, the same technology behind Starlink. That's coupled with all of the usual offerings from the company as well. Possibly my favourite line from the interview was, quote, "Customers don't care where the wiggly amps come from. They do want to be clear that the people providing the service understand those wiggly amps." End quote. Essentially, people care about the service and its quality and price and not the name of the invoice at the end of the day, something I'm sure that we're all familiar with when it comes to our broadband providers at home. Read the story for more, including some information on what the new Viasat 3 service will mean when that rolls out to maritime customers in the next couple of years. Over to you.
That is a marvellous quote and just very sort of how Ben actually talks. The first week of August, well, it only actually had 2 working days, so there wasn't a huge amount of material to choose from. But standing out was the performance of shipyards. It's fair to say that even by the standards of the maritime industries, the last decade has not been a particularly enjoyable time to run a shipbuilding yard. But it is a very different picture today. At the now dominant Chinese shipyards, new building orders were up some 43.9% in the first half of the year, with over 55 million deadweight of new tonnage booked in. That's a lot of ships. Figures were buoyed by a return of tanker new buildings, including VLCCs, and a resurgence in container ship orders. Chinese shipbuilders are now expanding their yards. For example, Hengli Heavy Industry, not so long ago the moribund STX Dalian yard, has started work on constructing a second production base in Dalian, as well as mulling an IPO on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Offshore shipbuilders have not been left behind in the resurgence, and Singapore's Seatrade, formed last year from a merger of Keppel Offshore Marine and Sembcorp Marine, has more than doubled its order book in the first half of the year to hit some 26.1 billion Singapore dollars. That's its highest level in a decade. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Gary, over to you for the second week.
Stay with us if you've heard about this before, but it's a service that I hadn't heard about being provided in US ports by a company called Stax Engineering. So I thought I'd write about it, and the picture looked cool, so that I did it. We've heard plenty about shore power provision as a means of reducing emissions from vessels in port, improving local air quality, which is a great thing to support. But when a storm took out the shore power service at the port of Wainami in California, they had to find a different solution. Instead of cold ironing, vessels can now hire the services of a self-propelled barge that comes alongside the vessel, deploys a long boom arm with a vacuum hose on it, covering the vessel's stack, and then sucking the exhaust fumes down into the barge for processing. Stax claims to remove 99% of particulate matter and 95% of NOx emissions before pumping the gases back out into the air. The method has been approved by the California Air Resources Board as a means of meeting its expanding regulations on emissions in ports. Tankers at terminals in LA and Long Beach will be covered by the rules from January 2025, and Stax has since signed a deal to provide the services at Shell's Mormon Island terminal in LA. I think car carriers and container ships are already covered as well. The company said in its last update that it had racked up 4,800 hours of operation and controlled 37 tons of pollution. It's got more barges under construction, and the regulation is spreading, so I expect that number to grow pretty quickly. Marcus?
Thanks. Interesting development, that one. Looking at what I'm actually covering in this episode, I realised I've got quite a theme of casualties in here. And of all the various casualties in recent times, the blast on the container ship YM Mobility at berth in Ningo-Zhoushan was, I would say, the most dramatic. Videos showed large amounts of white smoke billowing from a container on the vessel's bow before a massive explosion ripped through it, sending a huge column of smoke and fire many stories into the air. Incredibly, given the force of the explosion, no one was injured or killed, as there had been enough warning to enable the area around the vessel to be evacuated. Initial reports and people I've spoken to have indicated it involved a cargo of dangerous chemicals. They were stored in a reefer container, however, the container was not actually switched on. The blast on the YM Mobility, the fire on the Maersk Frankfurt in July off India, and the Northern Juvenile off Singapore in May have prompted renewed concerns over container ship fires. Last year saw a container cargo fire on average every 9 days, according to numbers from the Cargo Incident Notification System, or the rather nice acronym of SINS. With container shipping operating at near capacity and with ever larger ships, there is a growing concentration of risk, something that was flagged in a circular by P&I Club Guard last week. Gary.
Yeah, nothing new in those warnings really, but a worrying upturn in those incidents, right?
Indeed.
So, third week, I had the pleasure of meeting Paul Hesbeck, CEO of Folk Maritime, for a podcast recording as we gear up here at Seatrade Towers for the Saudi Maritime Logistics Congress in Dammam on September 18th and 19th. Folk is a new short sea and feeder operator based in Saudi Arabia with the backing of the Kingdom's Public Investment Fund. Support from PIF means Folk can afford to have a different outlook on the market, said Hesbeck, taking a longer term view in the sort of value of building out a network. Anchoring regional trades to hubs in Jeddah and Dammam has geopolitical upside to Saudi Arabia, he said, building better trade connections to its neighbours, and then there's the obvious soft power side of things to consider too. I strongly recommend listening to this episode. Hesbeck is an experienced leader in container shipping. His immediate past role was at Hamburg Süd, and he's surprisingly candid on the topics that we cover in the conversation, which include Folks' plans to order new builds for its fleet in 3 or 4 years' time, his thoughts and experience on the support Focus had from the existing Saudi maritime market, which historically has mostly been centered around tankers and the offshore industry, and how the company has dealt with disruption in the Red Sea, which is a pretty big deal for a company looking to expand into the Red Sea and connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf. Folks' near-term plans are to launch a new service connecting Saudi to India, and as much as I keep referring to them as a feeder company in my stories, short sea shipping takes an equal share in their longer term plans, including a vision of Folk containers carried on Folk vessels flying the Saudi flag for Folk's customers. Give it a listen and keep your eyes on Seatrade Maritime News later in September for all of the latest updates from Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Maritime Logistics Congress conference and show floor. Marcus.
Yeah, interesting development, that line. You mentioned the word disruption there. And if there is a word that has loomed large over shipping and supply chain over the last few years, it is disruption. Speaking to a leading supply chain executive recently, he said at the end of each year since the onset of the pandemic, he would tell his staff, the past year has been tough, but next year will be better and it'll be a more normal market. And each year it's not been the case. And now he says he stopped saying that to his staff, and it's not hard to see why. This year, we've already had the mass rerouting via the Cape of Good Hope to avoid Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, and then port congestion as shippers preempted further potential disruption with an early peak season. The next big potential spanner in the works, as our correspondent Nick Savridis reported, is the looming possibility of a US East Coast port strike. Talks on a new labour contract between unions and employers have hit an impasse, and the International Longshore Association has warned that its 85,000 members will strike on October 1 if a new contract is not agreed ahead of that date. Analyst Sea Intelligence estimated that US East Coast ports would handle 2.3 million TEU in October alone. That would equate to an impact of 74,000 TEU a day. So we're talking very significant cargo volumes here. If your container has just left Asia for the US East Coast, here's some bad news. The ports could be on strike by the time it gets there. If all that wasn't enough, later in August, Canadian rail freight providers CN and CPKC locked out workers for 18 hours in a pay dispute before the government stepped in, mandating arbitration between the union and employers. Oh, and there is still a lingering threat of a port strike on Canada's west coast at the country's key gateway ports. The threat of disruption is not going away.
Yeah, these have been bubbling away for some time, right? I think a lot of outlooks have had the line at the end, more or less depending on what's happened in the North American labour disputes. It'll be interesting to see how things develop.
Indeed, and it's getting closer now, so let's see what happens.
Yeah, crunch time. What are we into now? Week 4? Feels like a long month, August. And I have inadvertently double-dipped on Saudi topics for August, but I'll spare you the blurb on the Saudi Maritime Logistics Congress this time. Bahri, the artist formerly and actually still currently known as the National Shipping Company of Saudi Arabia, have bought 9 VLCCs in a $1 billion deal with Marinakis-controlled Capital Maritime and Trading. The ships are an average of 5.9 years old and have scrubbers fitted, as is common with the largest tankers. VLCCs will be delivered in batches through to the end of Q1 2025. Bahri's put down a 10% deposit and will pay the remainder on delivery. It sort of feels like they're treating them like a builder they don't quite trust. Bahri said the new ships will enable the phase-out of older vessels in its 39-strong fleet. The oldest VLCCs listed on Bahri's website are a quartet of 1996-built vessels, so now 28 years old? And its youngest ships, besides these recent acquisitions, are 5 ships which were built in 2018. No surprise, really, that Saudi Arabia is comfortable that it will be exporting crude for some time to come, and it's planning to make sure it has the fleet in place for that.
I'm impressed how you got the reference to Prince into that story. Right, moving on to something somewhat more serious, and staying with the topic of casualties, I'm going to go back to a casualty from 3 years ago, or over 3 years ago actually, the Express Pearl. It grabbed the headlines with the sight of a nearly brand new container ship in flames off the coast of Sri Lanka in May 2021. Not surprisingly, given the sums of money involved, cargoes, etc., court cases have dragged on ever since. But what is less well known around all of this is that the vessel's master, Russian citizen, Captain Vitaly Chulakalo, has been unable to leave Sri Lanka since May 2021. His passport impounded, and there is no certainty at all as to how much longer he will have to remain in Sri Lanka. I had the opportunity to talk with Captain Vitaly about the incident itself and the impact of being unable to leave Sri Lanka, the whole uncertainty of not knowing when he will be able to leave, and the impact that has had upon himself and his family, including missing major life events and even suffering a heart attack. It's quite a lengthy tale, so rather than going into details here, I urge you to go to the link in the show notes, read his story, and share it with your circles to try and get some movement on this case. Posting the story on my LinkedIn feed, many of my followers expressed outrage and condemnation over the master's treatment, and it's not hard to see why. I'll leave it there. I urge you to read the story, and I will just say his employers, Express Feeders, should be commended for the support they have given to their master.
Yeah, these stories are far too common. I am following up 2 other stories along these same lines, and yeah, it's a shame that they need the support of the media and wider industry and that things aren't sorted out on their own, but criminalisation of the seafarer very much a real thing.
Indeed, a somewhat depressing topic, and I look forward to those stories when you manage to put them together.
Another issue that comes up quite a lot when it comes to seafarer happiness and well-being is shore leave. It's something crews seem to have less and less of and less access to, especially in the wake of the pandemic and the sort of closed-door policy to those feeding and providing power to most of the world. The International Christian Maritime Association, ICMA, is seeking input on its proposed amendments to the Maritime Labour Convention 2006, changes which strengthen and protect the provision of shore leave to seafarers. The changes will be presented at the International Labour Organization's special tripartite committee meeting in April 2025, which brings together governments, ship owners, and seafarer representatives. Proposed changes include new text that requires member states to ensure owners of ships operating under their flags provide shore leave to benefit the health and well-being of seafarers. Another section adds a requirement to facilitate seafarers' access to member states' ports so that shore leave can be had. Further additions require transit through port facilities for shore leave that is timely and that comes at no cost to the seafarer. Shore leave and access to welfare facilities is to be considered in port facility security plans, and training is to be provided for port and terminal personnel on protecting seafarers' rights, including those around shore leave. Check the show notes for a link to the story, and in there you will find a link to ICMA's website. There's the means to provide any feedback that you have on their proposed text, as well as the full text that you can check out there as well.
Very important topic, and I urge you to go and check that out. I'm going to round out this episode now, and I'm also going to shoehorn casualty into this final story that I'm going to talk about. In shipping's quest to decarbonise, there can be no doubt that many players are now looking to ammonia as a zero-carbon fuel. The last week of August saw Norwegian owner Eidsvik Offshore announcing it was converting one of its platform supply vessels to dual-fuel ammonia with an engine from Wärtsilä. The aim of the conversion, which has EU funding through the Apollo project, is to produce modular designs to enable quick adoption of ammonia as a fuel, both for conversions and new buildings. The press releases were variously headlined landmark and game changer, and talked about how proud the companies were to be at the forefront of the movement. However, while there definitely is a push for ammonia as a fuel across continents, I've also been hearing sort of growing disquiet for some time now in the industry over safety, especially if there is a major casualty given ammonia's high toxicity. Attending a Nautical Institute Singapore conference the previous week, I'd actually heard some of this unease voiced in public. In a very frank and good discussion, dealing with an ammonia spill will be very different from an oil spill. It will require different specialised equipment. And given the danger to human life that ammonia causes, salvors may simply have to sit and wait for weeks to board a vessel involved in an ammonia spill. Indeed, in a real-life example involving an ammonia carrier, it took salvors nearly 2 weeks to board the vessel. Concern was also raised that the current risk planning looks at small-scale leaks rather than a worst-case scenario incident, such as some of the casualties we've been seeing recently. Just to draw a comparison with accidents on land, ammonia incidents on land can be deadly. If you Google ammonia road tanker accident, the first result is an accident from Illinois in October 2023 that left 5 dead. On that somber note, that's all we have time for in this episode. If you want to learn more about all the stories featured in this episode, there are links in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.